welcome to everybody who's joining us today. JP, are we ready to get started? Yeah, all attendees are on. A very good morning or good afternoon or good evening from whatever part of the world you're joining us from. We are inviting almost 350 participants from across the globe, over 26 different countries. So you're all very welcome to join us today. This is being hosted by Cork Against Human Trafficking, MECPATHS and the Sexual Violence Centre in Cork. And you'll hear a little bit more about those organisations as we go through the seminar. We really wanted to take this time out to curate a diverse range of speakers, because as the world has come to almost a standstill due to the global pandemic, we felt like the conversation around victims of human trafficking was becoming quite dull and hard to hear. And so we wanted to take this time out to examine the impact that this global pandemic has had on both the victims of human trafficking, including children and adults, but also the impact that the pandemic has had on the practitioners and frontline organizations that are working to counter human trafficking in the world today. So a few housekeeping items before we proceed with the webinar today. For all of you joining us, all of the participants, you will not have any video or microphone enabled for the duration. The only participants that will have their video and microphone enabled will be the panelists themselves. The format of the day is that we will have 6 different speakers contributing. I'm going to introduce them one by one. They're going to present the things that they have experienced to date since the introduction of COVID-19. And they're going to look a little bit about how this has impacted the work that they're doing and the kinds of things that they're seeing in terms of the impact on victims of human trafficking. After our 6 panelists have shared, we will leave about 20 to 25 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. So if you have questions throughout the webinar, I would ask that you would go to the Q&A chat box on your screen, and you will be able to direct your question to whatever speaker you wish to address. And then I will, as moderator, at the very end of our webinar together, address each specific question to each of the speakers. And we'll obviously get through as many questions as time allows. If you're having technical difficulties, we do suggest that you leave the chat room and then re-enter, and that tends to help, and hopefully that will not be an issue for you. And then also, if you want to join in on the social media discussion, we would invite you to follow Cork Against Human Trafficking, and they will be providing live updates throughout the webinar, and the hashtag we invite you to use is #Hidden in Plain Sight. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you our first speaker, Mary Crilly. And for those of you who don't know Mary, she has almost 30 years of experience as an advocate for victims of human trafficking and of sexual abuse and domestic abuse. She has been working in this area, as I said, for 30 years. She's the founder of the Sexual Violence Centre in Cork. And when I say, I mean this as the highest of compliments, she is the loudest, most fierce voice in this country in terms of speaking out against gender-based violence and the atrocities that we see play out. She's also the founder of Cork Against Human Trafficking, and here to tell us a little bit more about that organisation. Please welcome with me, Mary Crilly.
Thank you, Anne. And my name is Mary Crilly, and I'm in the centre since '83, so it's nearly 40 years, as you can see by the grey hair. The reason why we're doing this, in 2005, the centre that I work in, Sexual Violence Centre, it would be a rape crisis centre. It started in '83. In 2005, we became aware of sex trafficking and the impact of that on people. And, you know, back then I didn't have a clue. I remember going to a conference. I remember thinking, I really don't have a clue about this, but I need to find out. I need to do something. I'm not about kind of picking up every gauntlet and running with it, but I think if I see injustice, I really feel I need to do it. But what I've learned over the years is I can't do it on my own. I really can't do it on my own. I need help, I need support. And the reason for this conference, or this seminar, was to try and make a difference, to make something happen, that we can learn from our own experience, our own interventions, our own creativity, our own things that work in other countries, because we will have similarities and we will have differences. So it is about working together. For me, it's about learning here and learning from people who have worked in different areas. But oh my God, at the end of it, let's just do something. We need to make things happen. There's a death anxiety from human trafficking. Like when I started in the centre in '83, child abuse didn't exist in Ireland. Rape didn't exist in Ireland. And we really fought that. You really have to keep chipping away. But I know chipping away can make a difference. And I just made aware of something this weekend about how people matter and how people do care. And it's about reminding ourselves that sometimes in this area, you can feel very low, you can feel overwhelmed, you can feel like, oh my God, is my little bit going to make a difference? And I think just for the 350 people who are online here, I just say thank you so much. Because just being online, you're saying you're making a difference. And there was a woman on to me earlier on who is a survivor, because I want to acknowledge that the survivors and those who are trafficked are not visible here, but they are online because they have texted me, and they do want to be here in that kind of way. Hopefully in the future, they might be more able to kind of speak out. And I want to say I'm not speaking for them, but when I talk from the centre, from my experience here, I talk from my experience. But just to remind people that people do care. There's a thing that we're reminded of during the week with the American Indian flag, the Choctaw American Indians who joined the Great Famine in Ireland over 170 years ago, when they themselves were going through the awful stuff in their own place and the trail of tears that they had to walk thousands of miles and thousands died. They sent money to Ireland to help the Irish people. And this week, the Irish people sent the best part of $500,000 to them. Now, for me, it isn't about money, but that really shows when we work together, we can do something. And for me, it really shows people do care. I mean, in the work I'm in, you hear awful things all the time, but you have to keep remembering people do care. Like this happened, conference just maybe even 2 weeks ago. JP and I having a conversation on Friday night, Saturday night, because I don't have a life. And I was feeling very hopeless, and I was saying, I need you to come up with something because I'm feeling very helpless and the silence is deafening. And then they said, what about this? Why don't we get together as two organizations, 4 friends, because Dora Toomey is involved in it too, and let's just do something. And this is why it came out. And when we asked people to come, they just came on board in a flash. And I want to say a huge thank you to everybody, because we're doing this because people matter and because human trafficking is there, and we need to break that chain. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you, Mary, for that introduction. Unfortunately, I do think we had a little technical difficulty in that some people weren't hearing. So if I could just ask all participants to make sure the microphone is disabled on your end, which it should be. But hopefully as we move on, those technical difficulties will be addressed. Next up, we have JP O'Sullivan, and JP has worked with MECPATHS since 2017 as Manager of Network and Communications. He has a background in social work and focused on adult mental health services. He has 8 years extensive experience on the ground living and working in India, where he worked on child development and protection policy there. And since returning to Ireland, he has been working with MECPATHS. And so to give a little bit of background to our project, would you please welcome JP.
Thanks, Anne. So I've been working with Anne in MECPATHS for a number of years. Quite often people ask, what is the work of MECPATHS? What is it we do pre-COVID? So pre-COVID, the work of MECPATHS was focused very much on working in collaboration with the hospitality industry in Ireland. We had acquired some fantastic partners to raise awareness around child trafficking. and how to prevent child trafficking, how to identify any children that may be at risk, in partnership with hospitality managers and staff. So the course of our work had been always working with the private sector, other NGOs, and indeed working with the statutory bodies. So we had a great relationship with An Garda Síochána and with the Department of Justice. When we look at the work through education and awareness raising, again, the focus of the work had always been on hotels. So we have some great partners in both Prem Group and also Delata, a number of hotels around the country, and also working with tourism training colleges. So Shannon College was one of our first partners. So working with the students in classroom style settings, educating them on human trafficking and child trafficking. So we managed to extend our partnerships there over the past 12 months, and we now work in partnership with a number of universities. So working with Maynooth University and also with University College Cork. Prior to COVID, we had arranged to build a module with Maynooth on child trafficking for their master's students in social work and also masters in social policy. Unfortunately, due to COVID, like much of our work in MECPATHS, we've had to revise, review, and reflect on how we work. And going forward, we would see a lot of our work taking place online. A lot of platforms are available, such as Zoom. So we'll be moving our work, and I guess our plans pre-COVID to move that work to online have been accelerated as a result of where we find ourselves now. So we're very aware as well that, you know, throughout COVID, we're talking about vulnerabilities for everybody in the world. Whilst people are finding themselves retreating and in states of lockdown, we're also very conscious of those who pre-COVID would have had access to support services, particularly children who may find themselves in environments of challenge or environments of abuse at home. Throughout the day previously, they would have been able to attend school, they would have access to food, to counselling supports and services, whereas right now that's not available to them. And those children are very much in our thoughts and I guess in our actions at MECPATHS, and looking at how we can engage more fully with communities who are vulnerable. So we were very fortunate recently to be invited by a group that we're a member of, the Special Interest Group in Child Sexual Abuse in Ireland, to collaborate with them to feed into some materials that they were offering to frontline service workers who did still have access to children's homes, that they could learn about maybe what to keep an eye out for when they were in the homes, how to spot vulnerabilities, and particularly, I guess, how to report and respond to that. It's very important to remember as well, you know, when we talk about child trafficking, that we're not talking always about children who are moved around the world for the purpose of exploitation. Child trafficking can take place when a child is moved 1 to 3 feet for the purpose of exploitation. And that's very much the definition or the core of the work where MECPATHS comes from. You know, we're looking at Palermo Protocol definitions, and we're using them to identify children around Ireland, in Ireland, children that have been brought into Ireland for the purpose of various forms of exploitation. So whilst the 2-kilometre radius that we had up until earlier in this week challenged a lot of people that were locked into their homes, like on lockdown, and then we had an extension to 5 kilometres in the past few days for the purpose of exercise, we have to remember that children and adults can be moved within those parameters for the purpose of exploitation also. So as we find ourselves in the middle of COVID, we're planning for the future, and we're trying to become more innovative. As I mentioned, we're planning to move a lot of our trainings from classroom style to online. So they'll be available to our hospitality partners when they return. Pre-COVID, or just weeks before the outbreak of COVID-19, MECPATHS were very fortunate to reach an agreement with a hospitality group in Ireland, deliver the training that we provide to 60,000 members in the country. So 60,000 people engaged and attached to the hospitality industry in Ireland will be signing up to the work of MECPATHS, or the training that MECPATHS provides, when we come out the other side. We've also been very fortunate, I guess, to use the period again to revise our focus, to look at where we work. We're very conscious that the hospitality sector will have their eyes on other issues when we do reach the end of this pandemic and into 2021. So the work of MECPATHS, we've been exploring our strategic plans, and we have revised to expand out to other service industries. This feeds into, I guess, feedback and requests that we had earlier in the year from private sector industry, from industries and companies who were wishing to explore supply chains and how it impacts on trafficking or can impact on child trafficking in particular. So while the world changes and while we wait to get back to normal, we're very fortunate to be engaged with organisations such as Cork Against Human Trafficking, and indeed to be connected with all of the panellists here today, whose efforts to counter human and child trafficking continue on. We're very much at painstake to say that, you know, those who are finding themselves caught in modern day slavery are not gone from the minds of many of us who continue to challenge and who continue to fight for their rights. So while we find ourselves changing in how we work, we look forward very much to getting back to our regular work and looking at how this will change the way that we work into the future.
Thank you so much for that, JP, and for that insight into MECPATHS as an organisation. Next up, we have Kevin Hyland speaking, and Kevin is a renowned international expert and specialist in the area of anti-human trafficking. He was appointed the first ever anti-human trafficking, anti-slavery commissioner, excuse me, in the UK. And he served in that role until he moved to Ireland very recently. He was also instrumental in the establishment of Santa Marta, and Santa Marta is a global alliance between law enforcement, the Catholic Church, and civil society. And that alliance is, has come together to eradicate modern day slavery. Kevin is Ireland's representative at the Council of Europe's group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings. And because Kevin travels so extensively as consultant in terms of sharing expertise and best practice in anti-human trafficking efforts, he has a very unique perspective on the global stage and what's happening. So to hear from him now, please welcome Kevin.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to everybody around the world. I know we've got people following us from as far away as Australia and all routes that far. So firstly as well, thank you to Cork Against Human Trafficking, the Sexual Violence Centre in Cork, and MECPATHS for organising this event. And as you say, it's a big challenge in our current world around how we currently are viewing the issue of human trafficking and modern slavery. And I think that one of the challenges we have previously is that, in fact, you know, around the world, we had so many different approaches to this issue. And now we need to split it down into three areas, I think, which is before COVID-19, now during lockdown and the impact that will have on us, and then post the current crisis as we move into the future, where we will have a crisis for some time. And if we think about before COVID-19, what did we really understand and what was the world responding to? As I traveled around the world, as Anne said, many of the things I would ask was, do people know what modern slavery and human trafficking is? Are we responding to it commensurate to the risk? For example, this crime generates $150 billion a year for criminals, and yet it's hard to find an investment above 1 billion that OECD countries invest. So therefore it's an unfair fight. And what are the resources and what does it approach? The legal frameworks, what are they? How are they being used? In the UK, Australia and France, for example, they have new laws. There are new laws developing in New South Wales. Probably the most advanced legislation in the world in New South Wales is soon to be released. And also, who should be doing what? particularly around statutory agencies. And what should not be done is also very important. But what does accountability mean? And what should scrutiny assist? Or is it purely negative? And one of the things I highlighted when I spoke at the UN last year, when I spoke in Australia this year, and the US and Myanmar and Thailand, was the fact that over the past 8 years, we have had an increase in legislation. And of course, since the Palermo Protocol of 2020, there has been a major change in the fact that there is now a requirement or an encouragement to create legislation. And if you're in Europe, in the EU, or in the Council of Europe, there is a requirement. But despite 164 countries introducing legislation, as you can see from these numbers, victims identified, particularly from 17 to 18, and that will go on to 19 when the new figures have reduced. Convictions have gone down from a spike in 2016. And particularly when you look as in brackets, the convictions for forced labour are at 259. And prosecutions in 2018 have gone down significantly from the figures of 15 and 17. So prior to COVID-19, there were many questions to be asked about where was progress, what were we doing, and what should we change? Well, some of the things I talk about prior to COVID-19 was supply chains. And we think about the mines, whereby we've got a world, quite rightly, that wants to have a far cleaner environment. But that meant there was a demand on other things, such as cobalt for batteries, for battery-powered cars, for our smartphones, for our computers. And we were forgetting all those impacts that were happening. And that was why I pushed and drove the drive for having a Sustainable Development Goal target 8.7, specifically for addressing this issue, because this is big money. And when I sat last year at a meeting with some of the biggest international IT companies, I asked the question, what are you doing? When you are making tens and sometimes scores of billions in profit, what is your investment to make sure your supply chains are transparent? But that also goes across those that deliver mica for makeup, for car paint, those in the fishing industry, a big problem, as we know, in Ireland, agriculture, construction, all have these processes whereby there was no investment pre-COVID to actually make sure these crimes and these abuses were not happening. But if we look at one particular area, Thailand, and particularly in Southeast Asia, recruitment fees is a particular issue whereby people are paying incredible sums to actually move somewhere else for a job. And when did that come really close to home? If we look at the cases that happened in Essex, we have seen the reported situation there where 39 people lost their lives. And we know from what has been reported in the press that some of those paid up to $35,000 to come to Europe, destined for the UK. As we know, in Ireland, there are a number of Vietnamese people as well, looking for jobs, big debts to get to where they believe the streets are paved with gold. So this needs to be addressed. This needs to be addressed at business level, at criminal level, and actually prevented, that we get rid of this recruitment cost. Of course, the Essex case was criminals doing movement of people, but this is actually in some business models around the world. And if we think that the billions of dollars that transfer on remittances around the world, which are greatly affected now because of COVID-19, so much of that is being taken by criminals or by people having to pay off debts purely to get a job. How can it be acceptable that to get a job when you're one of the lowest paid workers, you have to pay 6 months or a year's fees up front? So then when you arrive, you have no money, you then have to pay rent, you stack up your debts, you stack up the interest, you never get out of that cycle. Happening. But if we look at what's going in our current position in lockdown, Are we seeing policymakers writing in the issues of human trafficking and modern slavery when they're looking at vulnerability? We see some of it, but we don't see enough. Is there a specific tailored response for traffic victims here in Ireland, in the UK, across Europe, Southeast Asia, the United States? There are not tailored responses, and we need to work on that now because there's an urgency. What has happened to all the people who are in car washes, in nail bars, those who are working in brothels? These premises have closed down, and we need to have a policy as we move out. How do we keep them closed? But where are those people? Who has got them now? How are they suffering, particularly if they're undocumented? So we need to look at migration positions, and we've seen some good steps forward there. Portugal, for example, made a policy whereby those who were undocumented in Portugal until July can have full support of health and benefits. As I said, we need to look at closures and planning for prevention in the longer term, but we need these plans to be drawn up now. We need to look at employment. We see that somewhere in some places, migrants are being brought in as seasonal workers. Do the policies make sure that they are protected from COVID-19 when they arrive? Or are they just arriving and being put out to work and being made to live wherever? We also need to make sure that funds and finances don't drop from this area, both at official government levels, but also for philanthropy and foundations. And we need to up our media and communication strategy to make sure, as this event is doing today, that this issue doesn't drop off the radar. There will be new drivers and enablers, which will happen because of this problem around the world. Poverty, in fact, the World Food Organization said, or the World Food Programme has said, they believe that up to 250 million people will be in famine. Famine. That's something Ireland knows too much about. And how many millions died during the famine of Ireland? 250 million people they expect to be in famine. So hunger. And that will in itself create a vacuum of the rule of law. And we know there's been great impunity on trafficking. There will also be new corruption that opens up as people look for opportunities to do bad business, maybe hidden in general business. Other priorities will take over, particularly from governments, as they look to other things that they see as a priority. We will also see a tunneled focus on the economic recovery and growth. In some ways, that is what caused trafficking in the first place, because it was so focused on just generating income and not looking at work and the respect for others. We need to make sure that strategies aren't just inward facing, nationalistic positions. The whole idea of the Palermo Protocol, of the EU directive and the Council of Europe Convention is to have those linked up approaches. We need to make sure that there is accountability on this issue, just like others. And we need more dynamic approaches and urgency, not just more of the same. So who is at risk at this time? Well, nothing has changed. It's the same people, but those risks are heightened. The seasonal workers, those in at-risk industries, whether that's agricultural, food processing, those who are in brothels, those who we see who are displaced migrants, who have no rights, are highly at risk as traffickers look for them. And of course, we have those who MECPATHS has spoken about, those in the hospitality sector who now have no jobs, not just in Ireland, for those people who were some of the lowest paid people in work. Who is looking after them and making sure their rights are protected and that some system doesn't operate, that criminals aren't there looking for them? Because we know that is already happening. If I look at the impacts on migrant workers in Thailand, we know that at least 150,000 to 200,000 crossed the borders into Thailand from neighboring countries in March. Those figures are shocking. And this is the impact this is having at this moment in 1 month alone of March. And we know that As of the 4th of May, 28 million people in Thailand had applied for cash payments for workers in informal employment. 28 million in Thailand alone. Look at how big this problem's going to be. That's why we need joined up approaches and strategies that actually can be commensurate and at least understand the risk we're facing. But there have been good policies. As I say, we saw in Portugal, an EU country, they came up with a very positive position. But also we see in Thailand, perhaps where you might not expect it, there's been extension of temporary stay status. Migrants who can stay until at least the 30th of November. Seasonal working permits holders can stay in Thailand, but must depart 7 days after the borders are opened. Compensation related COVID-19 for workers whose jobs are affected, and postponing of approvals of new MOUs for workers from the neighbouring countries of Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar and Vietnam, which are so important. But post-lockdown, the new position. Well, we must reduce the costs, length and complexities of regular migration. That's been something that has been needed for a long time. But now we need to make sure it happens. Whilst we are talking about people and we're worried about people, let's keep the pressure on. We must clarify which costs should be borne by employers. Recruitment fees should be out if they're paid by the worker. We should increase the capacity of employers and recruitments on ethical recruitment throughout. We must anticipate the impact of COVID-19 on regular work across the world. We need to make sure there's health screening, quarantine, pre-departure and post-arrival information, infection prevention measures en route, no matter where they're moving from or coming from or where they work or where they live. And we need to make sure people who are the lowest paid or in at-risk industries have health insurance, sick leave, living wage, skills developments and job matching. That has been essential all the time. But now we've got this opportunity to focus on these as a development out of COVID. We need to focus on these and make sure these happen and building the measures that we need. This goes back to where I started. In order to do those things, we need to know what human trafficking and modern slavery is and where it's happening. We need to know the legal frameworks and what is needed. We need to know what needs to be done, by whom and how. And we need to create frameworks that make sure that happens. We've got commitments at the EU. I was part of those meetings. We had commitments at the Council of Europe. We need to make sure they're delivered. We have commitments at the G7, the G20. And a crucial part of this will sit with the G20, representing 85% of the world's economy and 75% of the world's population. The G20 is where we need to focus a lot of this, because that will be where decisions can actually be delivered. So we need to point out what should be done and how quickly it needs to be done. And we also need to get really smart on accountability and scrutiny. We see nations like the UK came in with great legislation, and it was wonderful to see 10,600 people referred into an NRM last year, but less than 700 got a conclusive grounds decision within 12 months, lower than any of the previous 4 or 5 years. 1,100 were rejected. So where are the other 8,500 or so, and the 2,000 from years before? Where are those people? How are they being supported? We need to make sure that scrutiny and accountability really meets what the challenges are. That just doesn't apply in Europe. It's a global issue that needs to be addressed. I think we have an opportunity from this crisis. It's a very tough time, particularly for those who are struggling. But without our voice, without us coming up with good policy at this crucial time, without us giving out measures and developing policy that will be for long-term change, then I'm afraid we will see all those people who are currently in modern slavery and all those that follow actually fall into such a situation that we will see this problem rise to a level that we couldn't have imagined. We will also see the fatalities and deaths that we already know happen in this issue rise beyond what we could imagine. This is a big challenge, but I think by coming together, understanding the problems, putting forward policy, really being positive about that, working with the organisations that can make change, understanding the issue, and then demanding that change by those who can deliver it, for example, the G20 and governments, then we can actually get to a point where we see this crime reducing and we can support people even at this very difficult time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that. There was a lot of information in that particular presentation. We're very grateful for the analysis you did, Kevin. I'd just like to remind our participants that there is an opportunity to put questions to the speakers. And you can do this by going to the Q&A box on your Zoom screen and typing that in. And at the very end of this webinar, I will be moderating those questions and getting through as many of those questions as possible and putting them to our speakers. Next up, we have Laurie Cohen. Laurie is a graduate of Yale Law School. She is also the executive director of ECPAT-USA. And ECPAT-USA is the leading anti-child trafficking policy organization in the United States. Prior to taking up this position, she created and directed the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families, Centre for Battered Women's Legal Services. And it was in this role that she has assisted more than 2,000 adult and child victims and survivors of human trafficking and other forms of gender-based violence. And we're just delighted to have her here today with us to bring her insights and perspectives from the United States. You're welcome, Laurie.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that lovely introduction. I want to thank Cork Against Human Trafficking, MECPATHS, and the Sexual Violence Centre Cork for inviting me to participate. I'm just so honored to be part of this international panel and to be thinking about how this pandemic has affected children, which is the focus of ECPAT-USA. And as you mentioned, ECPAT-USA is part of the global ECPAT community. Our mission is to protect every child's basic right to grow up free from the threat of sexual exploitation and trafficking. And I think what is important for us to be thinking about during the pandemic is that our children are really at risk of both of these interrelated sexual exploitation and trafficking. And one of the immediate issues that we have been thinking about is there's been a tremendous amount of discussion of social distancing as a way to maintain safety. And our deep concern is that social distancing, in fact, does not necessarily create safety. It creates opportunities for exploitation. So a little background about ECPAT-USA before I start talking about our work during this pandemic. We were founded about 28 years ago in the United States. ECPAT International is just celebrated its 30th year. And there was a recognition in the United States that stakeholders in the US should really be participating in this global concern to protect children. And my predecessor, Carol Smolensky, formed ECPAT-USA and indeed remained in this position until last November, when I had the honor of following in her footsteps. And Carol recognized very early on that the most effective way within the US to address the concerns of, at that time, the focus was on child trafficking, was through looking at public policy, so thinking about legislation, thinking about education for children, and then also private sector engagement. And we continue to have those three strategies as we have grown over the years, and indeed as we are negotiating our way through the pandemic. So what is it that we have been seeing in the United States during this time of social distancing? Schools have closed everywhere. And in the US, and I imagine throughout the world, those who have access to the internet have shifted all of their online learning for children to the internet. So we have the brick and mortar schools have closed their doors, and now everything is being done online, which means that teachers, school nurses, social workers, administrators no longer have daily contact with children. And as many of us know, those educators who are working so closely with kids are the eyes and ears. They serve their function, watching children, but also monitoring to see if those children are safe. And so children who may be isolated, who may be in abusive homes, who may not be living with family members, but with other individuals who might be exploiting them and victimizing them, now no longer have access to a crucial support network that not only, taught them reading and writing, but really was watching out to make sure that they were safe. At the same time, we see that many members of law enforcement in the United States have been struck with coronavirus. And so policing has been impacted by this. So I have had contact with human trafficking units here in the United States who are tasked with investigating instances of trafficking. And what I've learned is that those units, while they're still functioning, their ability to go out and interview witnesses, their ability to do the type of in-person monitoring that they were doing before has been severely compromised, and their ranks have been very gravely impacted. So we have some reduced ability by specialized individuals in law enforcement who were tasked with investigating these crimes. They've suffered a serious and significant slowdown in their ability to work. Now they are still doing some monitoring, but much of that is online monitoring, distance monitoring. But for people in the law enforcement community, it's so critical to be able to interview people, to be able to have that face-to-face contact, and that now has been reduced. Children who are engaged in all of their online learning are also now doing all of their socializing online, and that means they're spending hours and hours in front of the screen. They may be home with their parents, but what we have seen is that most parents of, we say tweens, I don't know if you all say tweens, we say tweens and teens, who are chatting online, who are using, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or Facebook Messenger. I think some parents understand how to use Facebook Messenger, but there are all these social media platforms that parents just really are not familiar with, and they're also not familiar with the world of online gaming. So that their children are communicating with people, but families do not really have an understanding, and parents do not have an understanding of who are their kids in touch with. And the internet it can be really wonderful, as in a circumstance like what we have today, where we're having an international conference to talk about how can we make our society safer from different forms of exploitation. But it also opens up tremendous opportunities to exploit children. And indeed, we are seeing a dramatic rise of kids accessing the internet, and then a dramatic risk of exploitation of these children. So our work of education had typically been education in the classroom. We were going into schools, we were going into middle schools, we were going into high schools, speaking with children and having these very interactive workshops on how to be safe. And we had 3 courses that we led. One was healthy relationships, talking about power and control issues within a relationship, talking about issues around consent. We had a class on best practices on online safety. And then we had a 3rd class on sex trafficking, and did this with the children. We realized now we can't do that anymore. So what we did was we created, let me see if I can move this along on the screen. We created an online safety guide for youth, and very basic, very heavy on, because kids like these imagery, we have a number of graphics for kids, and created a very short pamphlet, but just very no nonsense. What are the things that youth need to be thinking about as they're chatting on the internet? We also have an Instagram campaign, the Y Act campaign, the Youth Against Child Trafficking. We had actually launched the Instagram campaign for children and for young people, and this is separate from the normal ECPAT-USA Instagram. This one is geared specifically towards young people, and we have a series of images that we send out and encourage young people to share them with their friends. Here's another one from the Instagram campaign. And another. You get the Statue of Liberty and the Chrysler Building here, a little taste of New York. And then what we learned is we were having conversations with parents about best practices. Talk to your children about the risks of online exploitation. Discuss with them, who are they communicating with? How can they stay safe during these times? And please adjust your privacy settings. And parents said to us, what are privacy settings? We don't know what privacy settings are. And so we created a much more detailed guide that goes through not only what are the risks, what are the concerns, but how do you adjust your privacy settings on some of the more popular sites. And we don't pretend to cover all of them. Actually, we have a long list of settings for video games, because there are just so many of these interactive video games that allow for communication, that we ended up including links to many of these. But this was really in response to parents' requests. And then also we participated in creating a training for the hospitality industry, for hotels. And this is a training that we had helped create a number of years ago. And we were recently asked if we could take the training back and host it on our website and make it available to the hotel industry for free. And this was something that we launched last month in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. A number of hotels are closed, but other hotels are looking for ways to continue to train their staff. And so now we have offered this training for free. And a number of US cities, starting with the city of Houston, adopted this and acknowledged that this would be sufficient to meet the requirements for jurisdictions that now set mandatory human trafficking training. So I am happy to take questions about this. I'm happy to make the materials available to anyone. I mean, even though we developed the internet material in the United States, in thinking about this presentation, I realized because all of the social media is global, I think much of the information might be useful in other countries as well. But again, I want to thank you for allowing me to participate in this conference, and I will send this back to Anne.
Thank you so much, Laurie, for that. It's really interesting to see how ECPAT-USA have had to adapt very quickly in light of COVID-19. And we certainly applaud your efforts there. I see there are lots of questions coming in. I would invite people to keep your questions coming. We will have time allocated to answering those towards the end of the webinar. Well, we're going to come back across the ocean, and we are going to hear from an Irish speaker next. Siobhan Mullally is a professor of human rights law and director of the Irish Centre for Human Rights at NUI Galway, which is a university on the west coast of Ireland. She is published widely in the fields of gender and women's rights. She's a commissioner with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and is also a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. She is one of the most prolific advocates in terms of anti-human trafficking work in Ireland, and I'm very pleased to welcome you, Siobhan.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me okay. First, just want to say thank you very much, a huge thank you to Cork Against Human Trafficking, to the Sexual Violence Centre, and to MECPATHS for bringing this event together and for connecting so many of us at a time when we're staying apart. It's really been a great event, and it's a great privilege to have been able to join with the other panelists. I'm going to give a quick kind of overview of some of the key legal obligations that apply to the context of human trafficking, and also just to reflect on their relevance in Ireland at the moment, and some of the key kind of recurring questions that continue to arise in relation to what the Irish authorities need to be doing to be more proactive to combat human trafficking. So really thinking about it in terms of positive obligations, primarily to prevent human trafficking in the first place, but where human trafficking is occurring, then to ensure that those who are victims of this very serious crime and this very serious human rights violation, that they have effective access to assistance and to protection. So I'm going to share a few slides. Hopefully this will work okay. And this is just to give you an overview. So to kick off, really the framework starts in the European context with a very strong judgment from the European Court of Human Rights. And I want to just cite this because the language is so powerful. It really brings us back to what human trafficking is about, this was the case of Rantsov versus Cyprus and Russia. It was a case concerning a young woman from Russia, Oksana Rantsov, who was trafficked to Cyprus for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And unfortunately and very sadly, she died while trying to escape from her traffickers. But the case was brought by her father. And it was the first judgment of the European Court of Human Rights which really identified trafficking as a serious human rights violation within the context of the Council of Europe Convention on Human Rights, and which highlighted the nature of human trafficking, its exploitative nature, the exercise of power, treating human beings as commodities to be bought and sold, usually in the sex industry, implying close surveillance of the activities of victims, circumscribing their movements, use of violence and threats against victims, and also often working under very poor conditions. So this was a very important judgment from the European Court of Human Rights, and it's particularly important in the European context because the European Convention on Human Rights can be given effect in domestic law. So we can rely on it in Irish courts, for example, and across the Council of Europe. So it's a critically important tool, and as we'll see, it's been used in other ways in terms of advocacy and litigation in the Irish context. So just looking briefly then at some of the international and European standards, some of these were already mentioned, and I just want to highlight them again. First of all, the Palermo Protocol, which is the international protocol or legal instrument that applies to human trafficking, and we're marking 20 years this year. So it's important to really think about how to make it more effective. Then in the EU context, we have the very important 2011 directive. And again, this is critically important, and we sometimes don't think enough about it because it has effect in domestic law, and it has very strong positive obligations on the state, in particular in relation to child victims of trafficking. And of course, we have the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings that Kevin already mentioned. And this is important because it has 47 states parties, but it's also used and relied on very broadly internationally. And we have people from many parts of the globe joining us today, which is great. But the Council of Europe Convention and the 2011 EU Directive are the strongest legal instruments with regard to the positive obligations on the state to identify victims and to ensure effective access to assistance and protection. They're the strongest in terms of the human rights-based approach. What I would say is that they don't do enough in terms of protecting against victims being forcibly returned or ensuring that there is effective protection at borders. But that's, I think, where we can use those and advocate for stronger implementation and better interpretations. Just looking at, I think this is a very useful table. It comes from the Council of Europe, the group of experts on action against trafficking in human beings, which Kevin is now a member of. And this is a 15-member independent monitoring body. The acronym is there, Greta. But in their snapshot of what were some of the key gaps across the Council of Europe in terms of meeting the obligations under the Council of Europe Convention, they saw consistently at the time it was 31 of 40 states that they were looking at, consistently there were gaps in relation to identifying child victims of trafficking, in terms of ensuring effective access to services for children, and timely appointment of legal guardians where there was a possibility of trafficking occurring or where children were unaccompanied or separated from their families in the context of migration, for example. And that delay is critical because it's within a very short period of time, often within 48 hours of arrival in a country, that a child, and we saw this across Europe, disappears. So it suggests a highly organized network. So this timely appointment of legal guardians, effective access to services, and a proactive approach to identification is critical. But very worryingly, this was seen as this was the top gap across Council of Europe states that were a party to the Council of Europe Convention on Trafficking. Others related to the assistance to victims, the provision of a recovery and reflection period during which a victim can't be removed from the state. And again, this is really important because it ensures that victims aren't forcibly returned or returned without a risk assessment and then face re-trafficking on return to their country of origin. And then victim assistance, identification, and state compensation. And again, these are central to the human rights-based approach that the Council of Europe and the EU was supposed to move on to take us beyond the limits of the more criminal justice focus in the Palermo Protocol. Greta, the group of experts, has published a number of thematic reports. One in particular I would highlight, trafficking in the context of the refugee situation that arose in 2015, which is often referred to as a crisis. And I think it's important to think about that now when we talk about crisis in the context of COVID-19, that what we're really talking about is a crisis of protection and a crisis of policy. And so this highlights the very important positive obligations on the state that need to be met if we are to prevent trafficking occurring in the first place. And also the fifth general report highlighted very specific steps that could be taken to prevent trafficking and ensure effective access to assistance and protection against re-trafficking, which is what we've seen happening in many situations globally, where people are forced to migrate, may become victims of trafficking, but then unfortunately, even in countries where they should arrive and receive protection and receive effective access to safety and assistance, they were falling victim to re-trafficking. So these were key points identified: identification of victims of trafficking not happening. Again, I think that finds echoes in much of what Laurie was saying in the context of social distancing, and this concern that we may not have the same proactive approach to identification happening. The risks of trafficking for children, particularly those who may be separated from their families, effective access to asylum, which is important in terms of longer term protection, moving beyond very short term assistance. And then the obligation of non-refoulement, not returning a person to a situation where they face a serious risk of persecution, and that includes trafficking. So again, watching what's happening at borders. Are potential victims being identified? Are they being pushed back? Or are they being given access to protection? And again, in the context of the current restrictions on mobility, there is a concern around what is happening when things go underground, and whether these obligations on the state, nonetheless, while ensuring public health and safety, that they are also taking steps to identify and refer to assistance victims of trafficking. Council of Europe has also highlighted in particular the risks faced by children. And here, this was an important step that was taken by the Secretary General against a background of failing across the Council of Europe in relation to children. So writing to all heads of states to re-emphasize the importance of a human rights-based approach and to emphasize these obligations. We've also seen a focus on labour exploitation, and this was in the context of a failure to really step up to recognise the continuums of exploitation. And Kevin already mentioned particular situations around seasonal workers, something that's very relevant now as we come up to the summer period: berry picking, fruit picking, agriculture, women in the context of domestic work in particular, being at risk, and in the context of less visible industries such as the fisheries. Now here again, there are very serious questions around what are the powers given to labour inspectors? Are they distinguished from immigration enforcement so that workers who may be at risk of being exploited or who may see others will report and come forward? So again, this is particularly a matter of concern at the moment as we see a shutdown in some sectors, but gradual reopening, and questions as to how proactive the identification, inspection and referral approaches will be, and whether or not access to services will be effectively protected and resourced at this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the Council of Europe group of experts has issued a recent briefing. All of the UN human rights treaty bodies, including CEDAW, the Committee on Discrimination Against Women, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Migrant Workers Committee, have issued statements around ensuring a human rights-based approach in responding to this pandemic, but also ensuring effective access to protection to those who are victims of violence, including trafficking. And I just want to note also a thematic report which focused on the role of civil society across Europe. And this is a concern globally, because what we have seen is a clampdown on human rights defenders, women human rights defenders in particular, and concerns around space, the civil society space available to human rights defenders. And that's particularly important given the role that NGOs and civil society, such as Cork Against Human Trafficking, Sexual Violence Centre, MECPATHS, the role that organisations play in prevention and assistance in particular. And in many parts of the world, we see limited resources, limits of funding, but also a repressive context within which civil society finds it difficult to operate. And here, the Council of Europe, the group of experts, was highlighting also the increasing criminalisation of humanitarian assistance to migrants. And this was happening in a number of countries across Europe, and of course leads to significant difficulties for those who are then trying to assist victims of trafficking. So that concern around mixing up of criminalisation of assistance and not being sufficiently proactive around ensuring that assistance and access to social protection is being provided to victims of trafficking. Just to note the various kinds of tools that are available, and I think these are tools available across the Council of Europe, but they can also be engaged with by UN treaty bodies, so they have a global relevance, the use of urgent procedures. And again, hopefully once we begin to recover from the current context, and we may need to look at situations that are emerging that require an urgent response. The group of experts at the Council of Europe has carried out a number of urgent procedure visits, including to Italy and Hungary, and also responded in a more informal and quicker way in written notes to governments to point out particular situations to highlight gaps in protection. The Chowdhury judgment of the European Court of Human Rights has been particularly important in the context of labour exploitation, but it touches across a range of areas, in particular where sometimes we see courts, we see investigators and prosecutors thinking about, well, there was consent at some point, so really is this a situation of exploitation? Does it meet the requirements of trafficking? And here the court was very strong that there may be prior consent, but that is irrelevant if the situation becomes exploitative. So consent may be withdrawn at any time. And there is a right to an effective remedy and to compensation. And that judgment was particularly important in Ireland in the context of the fisheries cases, which have now been settled. But the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission was an amicus in those. So again, just keeping in mind the importance of using these various tools. Just to finish up, highlighting some of the comments that have been made specifically about Ireland and continuing gaps. And although we are concerned at the moment with many very pressing issues around health and well-being and the right to life, of course, we need to realise that these are gaps in relation to Ireland's obligations on human trafficking that have been persisting for some time. So looking at the statement of the UN Committee on Racial Discrimination, just in December 2019, they highlighted again the need to properly enforce our legislation to improve victim identification and referral for assistance. And they specifically called again to enact legislation to provide victims of trafficking with rights to assistance, so that there is a statutory basis. And that's really important because it's important to accountability, to transparency, and to ensuring that victims, that it's not left to the discretion of individual officials, and that there is a statutory basis. The Council of Europe has highlighted the same issues for several years now, going back to the P case in the High Court, which was a really important case involving a Vietnamese woman who was found locked into a cannabis grow house. But there, the High Court found that Ireland hadn't put in place an appropriate victim identification process, and also did not have an appropriate process in place to guarantee non-punishment of victims. And again, the Council of Europe has reiterated these points, urging the Irish authorities to take steps to implement these findings, with the aim to ensure that all victims of trafficking, including Irish citizens and all EU and European Economic Area nationals, are identified and are given access to assistance. They've also highlighted, and JP and MECPATHS have highlighted in particular the work being done around prevention of child trafficking in Ireland. But I would say that the Council of Europe and more recently the UN Special Rapporteur on Sale and Sexual Exploitation of Children, Maud Bokikio, who visited Ireland, and her report is published and available. She highlighted particular concerns around gaps in identification and assistance to children, particularly Irish children, and the continuing concerns around online sexual exploitation and the need to be more effective in prevention and protection. On the fisheries industry, we've mentioned this already, but here again, I would highlight the importance of the state needing to look at immigration regimes, and this is something Kevin mentioned, that unless we have greater access to safe and regular migration and decent work, then you will find people migrating and being pushed into situations where they may become exploited and ultimately trafficked for a range of purposes. And finally, I just want to note the role of civil society, and I think this is particularly important in the context of this conference today. The Council of Europe has highlighted the importance of ensuring multi-agency involvement in identification of victims of trafficking. So setting up a formal role for actors such as non-governmental organisations, service providers, social workers, healthcare staff, so that identification is not linked or resting solely with law enforcement bodies. And that's really important in the current context where we see law enforcement focusing on different kinds of questions, and where we know that non-governmental organisations, service providers, women's refuges are continuing to provide critical services and may be able to identify what is happening in this context of social distancing and lockdown. And again, this is something that's been called on for the Irish authorities to adopt this kind of approach for several years now. So it's time, I think, that we need to see action being taken on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Siobhan. That was an incredibly comprehensive presentation and lots of information in that. And thank you also to the participants on this webinar who are sending in their questions, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end to put those to our speakers. We are now going to cross another sea, the Irish Sea, and our next speaker is Garry Smith. And Garry is the CEO of the Medaille Trust. He has 20 years experience working at a senior level in the charity sector, including anti-slavery charities. The Medaille Trust exists to provide refuge and freedom from modern slavery, and is the largest provider in the UK of supported safe house beds for victims of modern slavery. So over to you, Garry, and thank you for joining us.
That's great, thanks, Anne. And can I just add my thanks to Cork Against Human Trafficking, the Cork Sexual Violence Centre and MECPATHS for organising this conference. It's amazing to think the technology allows us all around the world, I think they said 26 countries, to link up and talk about this important issue. I'm going to share my screen with you. I'm hoping the technology works for you. I'm going to give you a bit of context first about who the Medaille Trust are, where we came from, and then move on to talk about how COVID-19 is actually affecting us in these days. So we have a strap line that says what we do is combating modern slavery by offering safe housing, providing support for victims, raising awareness in communities, and partnering with law enforcement authorities. And our genesis really goes back to this lady, Sister Anne Teresa, Sister Anne Teresa, a woman religious living in the city of Southampton on the south coast of England, and like many women religious, working in a community and meeting community needs. And in the mid-2000s became aware of some street sex workers who are unlike those that she'd met before. They'd come from predominantly from Eastern Europe, and that they hadn't really made a choice to go into that type of work. She found that they'd been trafficked to be there, and she was outraged. But like all women religious, she'd taken a vow of poverty. She had no physical or financial resources of her own. But any of you who have met women religious will know that they can be very persuasive when they are passionate about a particular issue. And Sister Anne Teresa gathered a group of other religious around her and started badgering people to give her resources. And because of what she did back in 2006 when Medaille Trust was formed, we now find ourselves, as Anne said, as the largest provider of supported safe house beds in the UK. We have a turnover of over £3 million, 118 staff, and 9 safe houses for men, women, and children. And that's a significant responsibility. We have 119 victims of modern slavery, human trafficking in our safe houses as I speak at the moment. So we have a particular responsibility with our sleeves rolled up to work alongside and journey with these people who are victims of this heinous crime that we're talking about here today. Our safe houses are all in England. Charity law means that we're kind of restricted in terms of our boundaries, with 3 in the north of England, 1 in Merseyside, 2 in Manchester, 1 in Wiltshire, a couple in London, 1 in East London, and 1 in West London over near Heathrow Airport, 1 on the Kent coast, and then 2 on the south coast, 1 in Southampton where we were founded, and 1 just on the edge of the New Forest. The 3 red dots that you see there are male houses. The others are all female houses. The 1 in West London and the 1 on the Kent coast both also take children with their parents. We don't look after unsupported children, but we do take families. So that's the size of our accommodation now. We operate a 4 Ps approach. So we look at prevention. So that involves us doing talks around communities in the UK, but also working with partners overseas. We have a particular focus at the moment on Albania. Albania is the biggest source country for adult victims of modern slavery into the UK, and we work with Mary Ward Loreto there as our partners. We have a really exciting project that's just about to commence. It would have commenced already had Covid-19 not have hit, but that's a really exciting preventative project there. We look at protection and making sure that people are kept safe, and that's predominantly the work we do in our safe houses. We look at prosecution, because victims of modern slavery are also witnesses to modern slavery, and we want to encourage those that we work with to seek justice. We think that's important for them moving on in their own lives, but also it's important that we start to lock up the perpetrators. As Kevin pointed out in his presentation, we're not locking up enough of them at the moment, and we need to do better. And if we can encourage those who are witnesses to do their part and cooperate with law enforcement authorities, which some of them are reluctant to do because of poor experiences in their own countries. But if we can encourage them to do that, then hopefully we can help to lock up a few more. And then we focus on partnerships. We recognise that we can't do this on our own, that we need to join forces with those who share our values and share our passion for this work. And so we work with anyone who shares our own vision for a world free of modern slavery and human trafficking. I'll give you a little bit of context for those of you not in the UK. I'm conscious that some of you will be aware of this and some may be completely unfamiliar. With regards to our national referral mechanism in the UK, for adult victims, the UK government has a prime contract with the Salvation Army, an international NGO that I'm sure you're all familiar with. The Salvation Army has held the contract for a number of years now. They're just about to, and when I say just about to, it could be any moment now, it could even be in my inbox while I've been in this conference, announce who the new contractor will be for a next 5-year period with a possibility of an extension to 8 years. If I were a betting man, which I'm not, it's as close to a dead cert that it will continue to be the Salvation Army. But the UK government is about to announce that it should be sometime this week. So the Salvation Army oversees support for adult victims in England and Wales, but they are supported by a network of subcontractors. As I said, Medaille Trust, we are the biggest provider of supported safe house beds. There are others who provide safe house beds as well. And then there is outreach support, people who are living in community, in asylum accommodation, living with family, with friends. And so we are one of 11 subcontractors. Some of them you may have seen their names before, some of them will be completely unfamiliar to you. It's actually a group of 12 because the Salvation Army do provide some services themselves, but their principal responsibility is overseeing the whole contract. So what about COVID-19? How is that affecting us as it's affecting you? Well, I want to look at 4 areas of work. Firstly, on the system, on our staffing, on support, and then I'll go on to some speculation. So with regard to the system, we only play a part of journeying with victims of modern slavery, human trafficking, and we recognise that they are all on a journey. We work with them and we journey with them for part of that journey. But generally, they'll be referred into us from the Salvation Army, who have received some notification from a first responder. First responder, principally in the UK, most of the referrals come through one of the UK police forces, but there are other first responders as well, local authorities and a number of NGOs, of which Medaille Trust are one. But in putting it in context, I think we referred 6 people into the NRM last year of thousands. So we're pretty small compared with the police. But then they will be given to one of the subcontractors that I referred to previously. They'll be with us. There is this 45-day notional recovery and reflection period. That I say notional because it's would be rare, and I'd fall off my chair if any of them were only with us for 45 days. We've had people with us for over 2 years. And as Kevin said, the number of actual decisions is very low compared with the numbers referred into the system. But at some point they will move out, sometimes before they actually receive their conclusive grounds decision. They may move to asylum accommodation, they may choose to leave, they may abscond, and that does happen. But there is a system in place that we are part of and they journey through. On the 6th of April, the UK government announced that individuals supported through the victim care contract will be allowed to stay in the system for the next 3 months. And where they'd normally be moved on, that won't happen. They will stay there. So what we have at the moment is a bit of a blockage in our system. Although people are still being referred in, and we have received referrals and we have taken referrals in the last month and 6-7 weeks since lockdown came into force in the UK, we can no longer move people out. That's not to say people haven't left. Some have transferred to other providers, and some have left of their own volition. But predominantly we have a blockage in our system now, which is a bit of a challenge for us because people are not moving on in their minds as well as moving on physically, and not knowing when they will be able to move forward to the next stage of their journey. And that has become a bit of a challenge for us in terms of looking after their welfare. In terms of staffing, I was reminded, and if you've done any management training in your time, you may recognize this model of team development developed by a guy called Bruce Tuckman in the 1960s, sometimes called the forming, storming, norming approach to teams. And I reflected the other day as I looked at what's happened to our staffing during this period, that really we seem to have gone through this forming, storming and norming approach in terms of our staff. In the very early days, we had staff who were very concerned about their personal safety. There was a lot of rumour going round, and there was a lot of stuff in the news about the effects of COVID-19. And when people were being told that they must stay at home and stay safe, we were saying to people, well, we need you to go into work. and therefore there was a lot of concern by our staff, and we were having to give them some assurances, try and provide PPE for them so that they could stay safe. They had concern about family members, people needing to stay at home, look after family members when schools were closed, about elderly relatives, and just a fair bit of panic around. We had a number of staff who went into self-isolation. Some of them were what's called shielding because they had medical conditions. Some of them went into self-isolation because they'd got a cough, and that was one of the indicators that perhaps they had COVID-19. And at that time, there was no testing available. So people were saying, I've got a cough, I've got a bit of a temperature, and therefore I won't be in for the next 14 days. And that gave us some real staffing issues in terms of our houses. Also during that time, in the storming period, we had planning and more planning. I attended more COVID meetings over Zoom than I care to remember, meetings with other subcontractors, meetings with the Salvation Army, meetings with our own team, daily meetings with our senior leadership team, just trying to work out how we were going to keep ourselves safe, keep our staff safe, and keep our clients safe during this global pandemic, which we didn't really know too much about, but there was a lot of speculation about in the media. And therefore, there was a lot of a flurry of activity around what we were going to do if everybody got sick in one of the safe houses and nobody could go and visit them and look after them. Nobody could, we couldn't get any staff in because the whole staff team had gone down, and there was a lot of panic going around our organisation. I have to say we've moved forward on that now, and we're now in what I would call much more of a norming stage. And as I rang around the 9 houses last week and said, what are you up to? I heard from this house in Merseyside that we had a volunteer coming in doing daily fitness with the men who live there. I heard and saw a video of a house in Wiltshire where one of our staff members was leading these exercise sessions in the car park. I heard about gardening. There's Christina there in our one of our caseworkers in our West London house doing gardening with the clients to get them outside and get them some fresh air. I heard about cookery in one of our safe houses, some really nice looking Chinese dumplings there from some of our Chinese ladies who live in that safe house. We had art going on in one of our houses, and people discovering talents for painting. Children's yoga was something I heard about in one of our safe houses, and people doing stuff to become what I would say is much more the sort of new norm that we're going. And so in terms of the Tuckman model, I think we're kind of coming through the norming stage now, and people seem a bit more relaxed about where they are and moving through into the performing stage to move our victims still forward in their journey. In terms of support for our victims, it's quite difficult. There's been a lot of cancellation of appointments. A lot of our time is taken up with taking people to appointments, various appointments to move them forward in their journey, whether that be to get documents that have been lost in their trafficking journey, or whether it be health issues. We're finding they're being cancelled. We're doing much less face-to-face than we did, much more online. And we're having staff that are working from home from time to time and FaceTiming their clients rather than clients just dropping in, because of the need to maintain safety and social distancing. We're seeing stir craziness among some of our victims who want to go out, don't understand, although we've given them information in their own language, they still don't quite understand this, and they want to go out and they want to meet with friends, even though we tell them they can't. But we don't operate secure facilities. They are free to come and go. But then others are moving into times of fear for their own safety. And we had an issue the other day with 3 of our ladies went for their daily walk into a park and then sat down on a bench, and the police turned up and moved them on, and now they don't want to go out at all. And there's a lot of fear about, as you can imagine, these are people that have been through some terrible situations and are now in a country that's responding to a global pandemic, and so that brings a lot of fear into people's minds. And we have some concern about mental health issues and the effects of COVID-19 on people's mental health. In terms of speculation, I guess the easiest way to say is we don't know what we don't know. And there is a lot of speculation about what will happen. with the next stage of COVID-19. What will happen, we understand in the UK that our Prime Minister on Sunday will be announcing some kind of lifting of lockdown restrictions. There's a lot of speculation about what that might be. But that may then bring us a second wave of the virus, which may then have a third or a fourth wave. And we don't know how that will affect us moving forwards. We have some concerns about the effects of what's happening now on the longer term mental health issues of our clients. And then we don't know what's going to happen with regard to new forms of exploitation. Again, there's some speculation around. What I can tell you is of the victims that have been referred into us in the last few weeks since we went into lockdown, the vast majority have come through homeless agencies or through the police who found them as homeless. We know that that those criminals who are exploiting people, when the people can no longer be exploited, or they're no longer a commodity that's returning anything to them, then they will potentially abandon them. And so when the car washes are closed and the nail bars are closed, if they haven't got any other form of exploitation they can put them to, they don't want to feed and house them anymore, and then they're just setting them free onto the streets, and they are homeless. We don't know what new types of exploitation will come in. I said previously we're working in Albania at the moment with regards to trafficking prevention, and I'm minded that the biggest driver, as far as I'm concerned, into modern slavery is poverty. And Kevin touched on this in his presentation, and Siobhan touched on it in hers. I'm minded of my last trip to Albania, speaking to our charity partners out there who'd done a talk to a group of teenage boys about the dangers of unsafe migration to the UK, and told them they really shouldn't do this because you could die if you went through unsafe migration, as people sadly do. And two boys came up to the person leading the presentation afterwards and said to the person presenting, "Thank you for your presentation. We understand the risks, but it's better to die trying to get to the UK because we have nothing here. We have no hope, we have no future, we have no jobs, so we'd rather die trying." As Kevin said in his presentation, there's a belief that somehow the UK has streets paved with gold, and therefore people will give it a go because it's better than what they have where they are. And when there is trying to be stimulus to our economy after the COVID-19 crisis and pandemic has subsided, you wonder who will take advantage of that and who will take advantage of these people with little hope in other countries, and indeed in our own country, to exploit them. And so we wait to see what that will mean for us. As I said, we don't know what we don't know, but what I do know is that we at Medaille have a great team. They're adaptable, they're committed, and I believe they will be able to meet whatever challenges come our way. Thank you very much for listening.
Garry, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for all of that information. We have plenty of questions coming in via the Q&A chat room, which we will be moving towards now soon. Before we go to the Q&A session involving all of the panelists, I'd like to invite Mary Crilly to have a closing word. I know that many of you were unable to hear Mary at the very beginning due to some technical difficulties, which hopefully have now been resolved. Mary, so over to you for, as always, the last word.
Take two now, so I'll be very quick just in case. I don't know what happened. So the first thing I'll do before we do another one, and we will be doing more, is get a better laptop or learn how to use it better. I just want to thank the speakers, and I want to thank Anne for kind of doing this so well in the great way she does, and for JP, my partner in crime, for deciding 2 weeks ago when we said we wanted to do this, that they just said, okay, let's go for it, and we kind of work in different ways doing it. I want to thank Siobhan, I want to thank Kevin, I want to thank Laurie, and I want to thank Garry. And what I really want to say to people out there who aren't involved in organisations is that you can make an enormous difference. Sometimes, you know, you can be overwhelmed in this kind of work and you can think, what can I do? How can I help? Just by making a noise about it, by talking about it, by speaking about it, by listening to say what Siobhan said about frameworks and systems not in place, and checking wherever you are, what are the systems there, what are the frameworks? Look at the demand, because the reality is Human beings are being bought and sold. It's modern day slavery. There's a demand. So we have to cut the demand, look at demand and say, this is not on, this is not appropriate, and we just have enough. The Cork Against Human Trafficking is an amalgamation of statutory and voluntary organisations in the city. You know, you'd have legal aid, you have the city council, you have organisations who work with asylum seekers, who work with migrants, you have Sexual Violence Centre, you have a huge amount of organisations who are raising awareness in their own way, and that's what we need to do. The only way we'll make a change is by doing it together. And I want to acknowledge again the victims of trafficking, some of them who I know are listening because they've told me they're listening, and they have emailed and they have texted, and we are not speaking for them, but we are speaking of our experiences of working with people who've been trafficked. In the centre here, we both work with them and we raise awareness. And I think what I'd like to come out of this is the reality that we will do something. This wasn't just a meeting to kind of get information and now go off home and do it. It's about what can we do differently now, and how can we work together, and for the speakers even to say to us, what now? And I'd love permission from everybody who signed on, who emailed, to let us use your email to keep informing you. We will set up more seminars. It could be on sex trafficking, it could be on labour exploitation, it could be working with children, because I've learned a huge amount, and I feel so inspired by the speakers, even by how quickly they came together. And I'm also inspired by my colleagues around the country, in Dublin, in Cork, in various places, who work with us, we work together to try and make a difference. And that's what you have to do. You just have to work together. But that one individual who's sitting there listening to this and thinking, what can I do? You can do plenty. And thank you so much again to everybody.
Mary, thank you so much for that. Inspiring words as always. I think we have about, let's see, 23 minutes for a Q&A session, so I'm going to move directly to that. The first question I want to take will be addressed to JP. Let's see here. One of our participants asked, how prevalent is the issue of child trafficking and human exploitation in Ireland, and when was the last study published on it?
Okay, so the straightforward answer to that is when we draw on the statistics that we're presented with, so national reports issued by the Department of Justice, it suggested that the problem in Ireland is quite small, so that we're not facing a huge challenge. So 60, 70 people per year are identified as being victims of trafficking. And that's where I guess there's scope for further exploration and conversation around identification. So the numbers that we're presented with are of those who have been identified. Our national referral mechanism, as Siobhan mentioned, is not quite up to the job, as they say. It's not doing what it should do. There are a lot of gaps, particularly around children, the identification of vulnerable children and children who are being trafficked in Ireland. We have spoken with people who work across the sector of social work, and they have unfortunately not been trained on how to identify children at risk. And that was one of the reasons that MECPATHS established such a strong working relationship with Maynooth University. People are slipping through the net, and there was a report published by the OSCE quite recently following a country visit, and they advised in relation to children specifically, I believe the caption on the article was, they're quite simply not screening for them. So the numbers that are finding themselves represented in reports are quite small, but when we consider that there are 40.3 million people trapped in modern day slavery in the world today, to suggest that only 70 of those find themselves at home in Ireland is far from realistic. To touch on the second question you asked, Dan, in terms of reports, there are reports published on a 6-monthly basis by various agencies from around the world in relation to Ireland and the challenges that we're facing. Particularly, I guess there's a strength in how Ireland is responding to the challenges that are being identified externally. So we've had reports from the OSCE, Europol, Interpol, the US State Department, which quite simply and collectively say that Ireland has a huge problem. We're not responding to it and we're ignoring it. So I think, to sum up, the numbers presented are not representative and our responses are not strong enough.
Well said, JP. Thank you so much for that. The next question, I think we'll direct to Kevin, if you can unmute yourself there. There was a question from a participant in Kenya, and she was referring to child labour in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And she asked, what would you propose to African states to reclaim the endowed resources and minerals from corporates who exploit women and children, and some end up buying from these children at exploited prices?
Yes, and that's such an important question. And I think that, you know, in January next year, for example, there is new EU legislation that comes in place, which is about conflict minerals, and specifically about buying, you know, high-risk minerals from countries like the DRC and you know, globally. And there has been for some time legislation in the United States, the Dodd-Frank Act, which puts restrictions on buying minerals that come from child labor in the DRC and the surrounding countries. And there has, you know, most certainly from those on the ground, they said there's been improvements, in particular in some areas where there's been a focus on the issue. But I think what we need to do, you know, this is such a big problem. You know, we have children dying in mines. You know, I've seen reports and seen, you know, productions about certain mines and spoken to the people in those regions where there are children dying every week in these mines. And those are to produce materials that we use in our world. And there's companies in that supply chain who are not just making a small profit, they are making billions. But then that goes back to the fact that they cannot survive without investors, so investment companies. And that is all globally connected. You know, some of these big companies, their head offices are in Dublin, or their European operations are in Dublin. So what is it that is being done to comply with human rights, to comply with the, you know, the legislation around the EU directive and the Council of Europe Convention, around the fact that we have committed as Ireland, but also as the UK, as the EU, as the Council of Europe, and at the UN, to say that these companies and these mines shall not exist. And that's why, you know, when I drafted SDG 8.7, it particularly talks about children and forced labor of children, and actually also about child soldiers, which is another form of child trafficking. So what we need is we need policy decisions that actually make sure that these companies behave in an ethical way and actually go and make sure that their sourcing is not reliant on child labor or on exploitation. And one of the things I've been pushing for internationally, and particularly say at the G20, is that we need to bring in this concept of tainted money. So if companies do look the other way or don't take the necessary steps, any profit they make, which could be millions and billions, should be taken from them and then invested in, you know, educating and actually working with children and working with countries and working with victims so that they're relieved from the exploitation. I'm actually, you know, only last week was speaking to some charities working in the DRC, and they give me a whole raft of measures where they think the approach should be, and they've been successful with, you know, up to 5,000 children so far, getting them out of the mines. But there is a big challenge there, and we need more investment. We need more accountability to the companies, some of the biggest companies in the world, and we also need the consumer and investors to ask those questions. And just to give you a really good example, a group of religious sisters bought shares in a pretty big company. They then went to the shareholders event in New York and they demanded change of a big company, a global company. They got change. So when we say, like Mary said, everyone can do something, and these religious sisters just bought some shares, became shareholders, went to the shareholders meetings, and they just demanded change, and they got change. So we can all make a difference. And that is big change that's coming from what they did, and we need to see more of that. Why should it be banks or investment firms, whether it's in Ireland, the UK, or anywhere in the world, the United States, are investing into things whereby children are being exploited, or worse still, are losing their lives?
Thanks, Kevin. Next question I'll ask of Garry. Garry, a question came in asking, how are families being referred to the shelters? Are there any private companies, not charitable organizations, providing accommodation, or is there a for-profit element of any sort to the provision of accommodation?
Okay, yeah, thank you. In terms of family referrals, they come in the same way as all the other referrals through the first responders. We're still getting them at the moment. We had just about 3 weeks ago, a lady referred to us who had just had twins. She was referred to us through the hospital, and she came to us straight from hospital with very, very tiny twins. They're still very tiny now. I saw a picture yesterday. So we're still getting some family referrals, but through all the normal channels and through the national referral mechanism. In terms of the for-profit element, in the UK, I flashed up the organisations involved and just with logos, and they are all charities. So Salvation Army heads it up, but to all the others, St John of God Hospital Services, Migrant Help, City Hearts, Palm Cove Society, they're all charities and housing associations. There is a thought, and there was talk that some private sector organisations may try and get involved in the next round, and certainly we had discussions with one of them, one of the large organisations who takes a lot of public sector contracts. In the end, they did not bid. They withdrew from the process. And my understanding is that nobody's bidding this time. What I don't know is what the Salvation Army's supply chain will be next time, but at the moment it's all not-for-profit organisations.
Okay, great, thank you. Mary Crilly, a question came in referring to Spain's practice of sexual exploitation of migrant workers, which was reported in The Guardian last year. Is there evidence of similar exploitation happening to migrants here in Ireland?
I think there's been evidence of that for years and years. And I mean, even before we started the Stop Sex Trafficking campaign in 2005, I remember speaking to a researcher at one stage who was going up to either a mushroom farm or some other kind of farm. I know it was a young woman around, and she thought she was there to do the cooking, but she really wasn't. She was there to service the labourers working on the place. I think sexual exploitation of women is the biggest exploitation. I think more people are exploited and trafficked for sexual exploitation than any other type. So it is, but it's about the demand. You know, we have to look at kind of, even victim blaming, in my experience, goes on with young girls who are trafficked. If you take somebody from Eastern Europe, for example, or from wherever they came from, where, you know, I find from going to schools where people say to me, did they know better? Are they that stupid? Did they really think there was a job for them? So I think when we're looking at people who are trafficked, we need to look at poverty. We need to look at exploitation. But above all, we need to look at hope, because somebody has given that person hope that something will change for them, that something will be different. And there's predators out there who are there just waiting for the prey to come, whether it's young girls who are trafficked or are trafficked. And that's the reality of it. And what I was hoping of this conference is that people are being given hope. And I can see from the messages coming in from people who are thanking, who are saying they're leaving, I think we are giving people hope. And that's what it's about. Because you have to really remember, these are real children and real people, and they're coming for a better life. And if somebody gives you hope, and don't forget, the trafficker doesn't look like this big kind of heavy guy all the time. It could be a young couple, it could be two women, it could be two young guys, it can be anybody who they think, oh no, it's not him. It's like sex offenders, in my experience. It's never the big monster, the guy in the bar who looks a bit creepy. He's just in the bar, looks a bit creepy. He's probably just minding his own business. It's usually the guy who's a charmer, who's a manipulator. So again, we will find lots of reasons to blame the victim, instead of looking at kind of why are human beings in this world using and abusing children, women and men. And the thing is, you see, we can stop it. We really can.
Thanks, Mary. The next question is for Laurie. Laurie, you mentioned that some jurisdictions in the US require mandatory training in trafficking in various industries. Can you remind us of what industries you were referring to there? And the second part of the question asks if we have such mandatory training in various industries in Ireland, and if not, why not? So Laurie, maybe just a little bit about the mandatory anti-trafficking training that's in place in some states.
So the mandatory training that currently exists is primarily within the hospitality industry. And again, in the United States, this is regulated on a state-by-state level. There's not a federal training requirement for hotels. There are, in addition, there are some cities that have mandatory training. There are many states throughout the US that have recommended training, and also we have poster laws in place, both in hotels but also in bars. There are a number of jurisdictions that have posters that are regulated with the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Some states like California also have California-specific phone numbers that individuals can dial for help. Actually, in thinking about young people, the National Human Trafficking Hotline realized that our toll-free number, or their toll-free number, was not successful in reaching young people. Young people don't pick up the telephone anymore to actually make phone calls. They text. And so with that in mind, they implemented a text line. ECPAT-USA actually has compiled the laws for all state jurisdictions in the United States and some of the larger cities in a semi-annual guide that is found on our website called Unpacking Human Trafficking. And it gives an overview both of the requirements for every hotel, what information they need to provide to their staff for training, also what posters are in place, and a number of the leading cities. And that can be found on our website.
Thank you, Laurie. I'll put the second half of that question then to Kevin. Kevin, are you aware of any industries in Ireland that require mandatory anti-human trafficking training?
No, and it's one of the problems that the whole issue of human trafficking, whilst there are countries like the UK that has mandatory reporting for businesses trading over a certain size, and Australia now has that legislation, and New South Wales, as I mentioned, as a state will have even stronger legislation, and the US has certain customs laws, and France has due diligence laws under its human rights legislation. There's a number of very powerful laws around the world. But then when you look at the response to human trafficking and modern slavery, and when I talk about this, I'm saying, you know, whether it's a big company or the landlord of a property in Cork or Dublin, they will have to comply with a whole series of measures: health and safety, fire regulations, tax returns. And if they breach any of those, there's a serious consequence to them. And this was very clear when a major sports supplier in the UK had people in modern slavery in their warehouse. Yes, there were traffickers involved who went to prison, but nothing happened to the company that wasn't monitoring its workforce. And they just said, oh, we'll have a look at it and we'll do a campaign. So we need something that mandates training. We need that training to be accredited. We need this whole agenda to be professionalized. When the police, for example, or the guards deal with crimes that Mary will come across all the time, and I know Mary pushed for this over a number of years, there is professional training which considers the victim and deals with the victim and works with civil society. We haven't seen that push very much around the world on modern slavery. So the professionalism and the mandated training, even though there are quite powerful laws around requiring reporting, but then we saw in certain countries, you know, and in the UK, we identified that there were companies that should have reported, hadn't done their annual reporting, but then were still getting lucrative government contracts. And where there is sanction, going back to the business side, and, you know, for example, the DRC, you know, the Norwegian Wealth Fund, obviously one of the biggest wealth funds in Europe, they withdrew all funding from a big company, G4S, because of the human rights breaches and the slavery in their building contracts in Qatar. So the private sector can make a big difference, but we need that mandated. And we need behind that mandatory training, accredited training, and accountability, just like when you do your tax returns, or when you do your health and safety certificate, or when you do your fire certificate. We need to strengthen up around this. If you opened up an off-license or a licensed premises anywhere in Ireland or the UK or across Europe without a license, you'd be shut down within hours. If you opened up a irregular car wash, a brothel, you know, a nail bar, or many other areas where exploitation continues and people generate large sources of income, the response is very slow and sometimes it's completely absent. We need to flip that.
And to follow up, Kevin, there's another question that tracks similarly to the one you just answered. And it's in reference to what you said about the need for scrutiny. Are there any specific areas or agencies or networks where there's a lack of scrutiny, in particular in Ireland, that you would recommend that groups attending this webinar could focus on pursuing?
I mean, we continuously hear about the exploitation in the fishing industry in Ireland. And we do know that the unions have raised that and raised it and raised it. And we've seen that criticised, you know, at the highest level on the Trafficking in Persons report conducted annually. We've also seen the fact that, you know, victims in Ireland are placed into direct provision. And I've continuously said, you know, how can you put a victim into accommodation where they could be sat in the same room as the person who exploited them or even their trafficker? And this person who is trafficked and needs support needs specialist help, just like the victims that Mary deals with who are sexually exploited. How can these people be placed straight into direct provision? This isn't a cost issue. This is about finding the right place, because we know direct provision isn't cheap. So we need scrutiny of the way victims are identified, and that means identification under what the Council of Europe calls identification, and the process, very much what Siobhan spoke about, multi-agency, civil society, statutory agency all coming together. We need that scrutinised, so it comes with something where we do start to see those numbers going up from 60 or 70 that JP spoke about. Then we also need to see certain industries, and that would be fishing, agriculture, and to a degree, you know, all the other jobs like transport, hospitality. We need to see those, which is replicated across the world. We know they are high-risk industries, and we need to start looking at those. You know, anything that involves migrant workers, and of course, the sexual exploitation that we see, which is common across Europe.
Great. Okay, we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to end with a question to each one of you, and I want you to answer it in 2 sentences or less. What would you say to people? I think a lot of times we're asked, maybe people joining us who haven't known very much about human trafficking, who have listened to all of the input today and are feeling quite overwhelmed as individuals. What would you say to an individual watching here today about how they can play a part in countering human trafficking? It's such a huge global problem. Where does one begin? In 2 sentences or less. Garry Smith, we'll start with you.
That's rotten starting with me, Anne. I would say, first of all, be vigilant. Be aware that this is something, as you said, with your hashtag hidden in plain sight. And so be vigilant, be aware of what's happening around you, open your eyes. And if you do see something, don't walk on by, report it to the authorities.
Garry, that was way more than 2 sentences. What about you, Laurie?
All right, I'm trying to think of how to say this in 2 sentences. So for us, first is safety is beyond hand washing, right? That be alert, be mindful that even though your children are home with you, that does not mean that they are fully protected against the current dangers that we are facing.
Thank you, Laurie. JP, see if you can do better.
I would say to be that nosy neighbour who twitches the curtains, follow the gut instinct, and if you think something is wrong, do something about it.
Kevin?
Yeah, I would say understand what this is. It's a serious crime and absolute human rights abuse, and start to raise the issue with the people who can make the difference and should be making the difference: your TD, your MP, your police chiefs, your local authorities, those who must respond, and tell them that they must do that.
And to the woman who always gets the last word in the room, Mary Crilly.
I didn't hear Siobhan yet.
Siobhan I haven't seen on, so I don't know if she's on it at all. Oh, she is. Sorry, Siobhan, I didn't know you were there. I didn't direct any of the questions that came in for you. I'm so sorry.
Third. Sentences, so I think it's critically about prevention and advocacy, and prevention of trafficking is essentially about gender equality, ending inequality, it's about combating racism, and it's about recognising children as rights holders.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. And Mary.
I think it's about keeping the conversation going. I think it's about looking at yourself, and you can only do what you can do. Don't give yourself a hard time if you want to do a lot more to make a difference to people who are trafficked. You can just do what you can do, and just keep the conversation going. Talk to your friends. Look at what's happening around your city, your neighbourhood. If there's anything you get involved in, look online. Just keep the conversation going. Keep the subject, because it's more than the subject, the issue of trafficking in human beings up there. So politicians and everybody will have to listen, because people do matter. And you know what? We'll be back, so we'll do more. And thank you.
We'll be back, and part of a webinar series, so hopefully you will be getting subsequent invitations. This seminar has been recorded, and you will all get the link to the recording within the next couple of days. And please feel free to review the content and to share it with your colleagues and networks. Thank you so much for taking the time to engage in this really, really important conversation today. And thank you especially to all of our speakers. Have a great rest of your day.